A single careless compliment can shake a heart that has never feared anything else. I did not believe that was possible until the night I unknowingly changed Nathan Sullivan with 6 innocent words. At 25 years old, I lived in a modest apartment in Queens where the radiator rattled every winter morning and the coffee maker only worked if I tapped it twice before pressing the switch. My world was simple. I worked hard, paid my bills, called my grandmother every Sunday, and reminded myself that ordinary lives could still be meaningful. Every weekday before sunrise, I rode the subway into Manhattan carrying a small canvas bag with my lunch and a paperback novel I never seemed to finish because I was always too tired to read more than a few pages. 45 minutes later, I walked through the wrought iron gates of Sullivan Manor, a breathtaking estate that looked less like a home and more like something preserved from another century. Marble staircases curved beneath crystal chandeliers. Fresh white roses appeared in elegant arrangements every morning. The gardens stretched across acres of perfectly trimmed hedges and quiet fountains. I was only one maid among many, and I preferred it that way. Invisible people made fewer mistakes. Invisible people kept their jobs. Everyone inside the estate followed the same unspoken rule whenever Nathan Sullivan entered a room. Conversations became softer. Phones disappeared into pockets. Even footsteps seemed quieter across the polished floors. Officially, he was a respected entrepreneur whose companies owned hotels, shipping firms, and investment groups across the country. Unofficially, no one questioned why powerful people waited patiently outside his office instead of expecting him to wait for them. I never cared about rumors because they had nothing to do with polishing silver, arranging flowers, or making certain every guest room looked untouched before another visitor arrived. During my first 4 months at Sullivan Manor, I spoke to Nathan only a handful of times. "Good morning, sir." "Thank you." "Excuse me." That was enough. He was always courteous, always composed, and somehow impossible to read. His blue eyes revealed nothing whether he was approving a multi-million-dollar agreement or thanking a server for another cup of coffee. The annual Sullivan Foundation Gala transformed the estate into a world that hardly seemed real. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway beneath the cool October sky. A string quartet filled the ballroom with elegant music while hundreds of guests wandered beneath sparkling chandeliers, wearing tailored tuxedos and evening gowns that looked like they belonged on magazine covers. Senators, philanthropists, artists, and business leaders greeted one another with practiced smiles, while photographers captured every handshake for the morning headlines. My assignment sounded simple enough. Carry champagne through the ballroom. Replace empty glasses. Smile politely. Stay unnoticed. Most guests barely looked at the staff, and I appreciated that more than they probably realized. About an hour after the reception began, I approached a gentleman standing alone near the windows overlooking the illuminated gardens. He looked to be around 30, with sandy blonde hair, kind green eyes, and the relaxed smile of someone who still enjoyed talking to strangers. He accepted a glass from my tray and laughed softly. "You have probably walked 5 miles already tonight." I smiled before I could stop myself. "It certainly feels that way." He chuckled. "Then thank you for keeping everyone refreshed." Without thinking, I answered with the same casual honesty I might have offered an old friend. "You are really handsome. I am surprised nobody has convinced you to dance yet." His cheeks reddened slightly before he laughed again. "That may be the nicest compliment I have received all year." We shared one brief smile before I continued serving the other guests, never imagining those harmless words had reached anyone else. As I turned toward the center of the ballroom, something made me stop. Across the room, standing beside the grand fireplace with a crystal glass resting untouched in one hand, Nathan Sullivan was looking directly at me. He was not angry. He was not smiling either. His expression remained perfectly calm, yet the warmth had quietly disappeared from his eyes. Around him the music continued, conversations flowed, and laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. But in that silent moment, I felt an invisible shift pass through the entire room, as though one ordinary sentence had awakened a feeling the most powerful man in the mansion had never expected to face. For the rest of the evening, I convinced myself I had imagined the change in Nathan Sullivan's expression. Men responsible for companies worth billions rarely cared about a careless compliment from a maid. They worried about investors, foundation speeches, and decisions that shaped entire industries. I lowered my eyes, balanced another silver tray filled with champagne, and continued moving through the ballroom exactly as I had been trained. Smile politely. Never interrupt conversations. Stay invisible. Yet something inside the mansion had quietly shifted. The string quartet continued playing beneath the crystal chandeliers, while servers carried elegant desserts from table to table. Guests laughed over business stories, charity projects, and vacation plans as though nothing unusual had happened. Everything looked exactly the same, but the atmosphere somehow felt different every time Nathan crossed the room. His executive assistant approached him carrying a leather portfolio. "Mr. Sullivan, the foundation board is ready for your address." Nathan accepted the folder without opening it. His blue eyes drifted across the ballroom before stopping somewhere beyond the crowd, somewhere close to where I stood. He spoke with the same calm voice he used for every important decision. "Delay the speech by 30 minutes. The assistant blinked in surprise. "Sir, the guests have already gathered." Nathan adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket as though discussing tomorrow's weather instead of changing the evening's most anticipated event. "Then they can enjoy another course before we begin." There was no irritation in his voice. No explanation. Only quiet certainty. Within minutes, members of the event staff politely informed every guest that the program had been slightly adjusted. Nobody questioned the decision. Nathan Sullivan almost never changed plans without good reason, and people had learned not to ask why. I continued serving coffee while trying to ignore the strange feeling that every time I looked up, I found him somewhere nearby. He never stared openly. He never called my name. Yet every few minutes our eyes met for only a brief second before he returned to another conversation. It should not have unsettled me. Somehow it did. Later that evening, I carried a tray of espresso cups toward a small group gathered near the grand staircase. The blonde guest smiled when he saw me. "I survived the evening without anyone convincing me to dance," he joked. I laughed softly. "There is still time before the music ends." He grinned. "Perhaps next year." Before I could answer, another guest requested fresh coffee from across the room. I excused myself with a smile and hurried away. When I returned only a few minutes later, the blonde gentleman was gone. His place setting had already been cleared, and another guest occupied the space where he had been standing. I assumed he had simply left early, the way many busy professionals often did after making their charitable appearances. Still, I found myself glancing toward the entrance without understanding why. Near the end of the gala, I stepped into the service corridor behind the ballroom to refill my tray. The kitchen moved with its usual organized rhythm as chefs prepared desserts and servers arranged coffee cups for the final course. Then the conversations around me slowly faded. I turned toward the doorway. Nathan stood there. During all the months I had worked at Sullivan Manor, I had never seen him enter the service area. Every employee straightened instinctively. The executive chef walked forward immediately. "Is everything satisfactory this evening, sir?" Nathan nodded once. "Everything has been excellent." His gaze moved calmly across the room until it rested on me for one brief moment. Neither of us spoke. Then he looked back toward the chef. "Please thank everyone for their hard work tonight." Without another word, he turned and quietly walked away. The moment the door closed, whispers filled the kitchen. "He has never come back here before," one baker murmured. Another server shook her head in disbelief. "Not once in 6 years." I remained silent because I could not explain what had just happened. By the time my shift finally ended close to midnight, the mansion had returned to its familiar stillness. I collected my coat, stepped into the crisp October air, and walked toward the employee entrance believing the strange evening had finally come to an end. I had no idea that the quietest jealousy I would ever witness had only just begun. Monday morning arrived wrapped in cool autumn sunlight that spilled across the marble floors of Sullivan Manor, making everything appear exactly as it had before the gala. The fountains still shimmered beneath the pale blue sky. Fresh white lilies filled crystal vases throughout the entrance hall. Gardeners quietly trimmed hedges with careful precision while the housekeeping staff prepared another ordinary workday. I almost laughed at myself for believing one strange evening could possibly change anything. By the time I tied on my apron and collected my cleaning supplies, I had convinced myself the unusual moments belonged exactly where they should remain, in the past. Then Mrs. Harper, our housekeeping supervisor, gathered everyone near the service entrance with a clipboard in her hands. "There have been a few schedule adjustments," she announced. That alone caught everyone's attention because our assignments almost never changed. She continued reading names one after another. Daniel will assist the carriage house. Ryan has been reassigned to the garden staff. Michael will report to the guest cottages until further notice. I listened quietly until a curious realization settled over me. Every male house attendant who normally worked inside the main residence had suddenly been assigned somewhere else. Olivia noticed it at the exact same moment. As soon as the meeting ended, she leaned toward me and whispered, "Have you realized there are suddenly almost no men working inside the mansion today?" I glanced around without making it obvious. She was right. Even the maintenance technicians who usually repaired lighting fixtures indoors had been reassigned outside. Maybe they are renovating something, I suggested. Olivia smiled with obvious disbelief. With every man moved somewhere else. That seems like an unusual renovation. I tried to dismiss the thought, but it followed me throughout the morning. Every hallway felt quieter than usual. Every room seemed strangely peaceful because fewer employees crossed my path. Shortly before lunch, I carried fresh towels toward the private library where sunlight streamed through towering windows overlooking the gardens. As I rounded the corner, I nearly walked into someone coming from the opposite direction. The folded towels slipped from my arms before I could catch them. "I am so sorry," I said immediately, kneeling to gather them from the polished floor. Another hand reached down before mine. Nathan picked up the last towel and calmly handed it back to me. "There is nothing to apologize for," he said. I accepted it with a quiet thank you, expecting the conversation to end there. Instead, he looked at me for a brief second and said, "Good morning, Hannah." My heart skipped so suddenly that I almost dropped everything again. He knew my name. We had never been formally introduced. Sullivan Manor employed dozens of people, and I had worked there only 4 months. There was no reason for one of the busiest men in New York to remember the name of a single maid. "Good morning, sir," I answered, trying to hide my surprise. He nodded politely before continuing toward his office as though nothing unusual had happened. I remained standing in the hallway long after he disappeared from sight. During lunch, I finally asked Olivia the question that had been circling inside my mind all morning. "Does Mr. Sullivan usually remember everyone's name?" She looked up from her soup with genuine confusion. "Not really. Department managers, perhaps. Senior staff most of the time." "What?" I stirred my tea without taking a sip. "He called me by my name today." Olivia slowly lowered her spoon. "Hannah, I have worked here for almost 5 years." She smiled thoughtfully. "He learned my name after I received an employee award last Christmas." I looked down at the untouched sandwich in front of me as another uncomfortable thought quietly settled into my heart. Maybe the gala had not truly ended when the music stopped. Maybe whatever had changed that evening had quietly followed both of us into the ordinary days that came afterward, and somehow I was the only person who still did not understand why. By Thursday afternoon, I stopped believing in coincidences. Every assignment Mrs. Harper handed me somehow placed me near Nathan Sullivan without appearing intentional. I polished the antique piano in the music room, and 15 minutes later, he walked through discussing investment reports with 2 attorneys. I refreshed the flowers in the East Library, and shortly afterward he arrived to review documents beside the fireplace. I carried fresh towels to the indoor pool, only to discover his morning workout had ended earlier than expected because of an unexpected change to his schedule. None of those moments seemed unusual on their own. Together, however, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Nathan never lingered. He never interrupted my work. Sometimes he offered nothing more than a polite nod before continuing toward another meeting. Yet every encounter left me with the strange impression that the enormous estate had quietly grown smaller, gently guiding our paths toward each other over and over again. Olivia noticed it before I finally admitted it to myself. We were folding fresh linens in the laundry room when she laughed softly and said, "Hannah, either you have become the luckiest employee in Manhattan, or someone upstairs keeps changing the schedule in your favor." I looked up from the stack of towels. "What are you talking about?" She smiled knowingly. "Yesterday, Mr. Sullivan thanked you for organizing the library. This morning, he complimented the flower arrangements you finished in the west hallway. I have worked here for years, and I have never heard him notice details like that." I shook my head. He was only being polite. Olivia folded another sheet and raised one eyebrow. "Nathan Sullivan is always polite. Paying attention is something completely different." Before I could answer, Mrs. Harper entered carrying another clipboard. Hannah, I need you in the West Courtyard this afternoon. Mr. Sullivan has invited an architect to review the renovation plans for the South Wing. Please prepare coffee and refreshments. I welcomed the assignment because it gave me an excuse to spend the afternoon outside. The courtyard overlooked beautiful gardens where maple trees had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson beneath the cool October sky. A long oak table rested beneath a white canopy, covered with architectural drawings and carefully rolled blueprints. I arranged porcelain coffee cups, linen napkins, and small pastries while a gentle breeze carried the scent of cedar through the air. A black luxury sedan arrived a few minutes later. The man who stepped out carried a leather portfolio instead of a briefcase and smiled before anyone even greeted him. He appeared to be around 30 years old, with neatly combed brown hair, warm hazel eyes, and the relaxed confidence of someone who genuinely enjoyed meeting new people. Good afternoon, he said warmly. I am Ethan Parker. I hope I am not late. Not at all, I replied with a smile. Welcome to Sullivan Manor. He accepted a cup of coffee and slowly looked across the gardens. This estate is remarkable. Most historic homes feel like museums. This one still feels alive. I laughed softly. That is probably my favorite description anyone has ever given it. He grinned. Architects become sentimental around beautiful buildings. We spoke for only a few minutes about old stonework, historic preservation, and how difficult it must be to care for a property this large. The conversation felt wonderfully ordinary, and for the first time since the gala, I forgot about strange schedules, unexpected encounters, and unanswered questions. Then the atmosphere shifted without a single word being spoken. Ethan's smile softened into quiet professionalism as his eyes lifted beyond my shoulder. I turned slowly. Nathan was walking toward us across the courtyard with calm, measured steps. His charcoal suit seemed almost effortless against the brilliant colors of the autumn gardens. Employees naturally stepped aside as he approached, not because anyone instructed them to, but because respect had become second nature around him. He extended his hand toward Ethan. Mr. Parker, thank you for accepting the project. Ethan returned the handshake with an easy smile. The pleasure is mine. Nathan nodded once before his attention settled on me. Hannah, hearing my name spoken so naturally somehow felt more personal than it should have. I quietly reached for the empty coffee tray, intending to excuse myself, when a cool gust of wind swept across the courtyard. Before I could react, Nathan removed his tailored overcoat and placed it carefully across the back of the chair beside me. It is getting chilly, he said calmly. You should not stand outside without something warm. Neither Ethan nor I answered immediately, because in that silent moment we both understood that the coat had not been offered because of the weather. Nathan's overcoat remained across my shoulders until the meeting finally ended, even though I quietly tried to return it twice. The first time, he continued discussing restoration plans with Ethan Parker as though he had not heard me. The second time, he looked at me with the same calm expression that never seemed to reveal what he was thinking and simply said, "Please keep it until your shift is over." There was no command in his voice, only quiet certainty. Refusing somehow felt impossible. When the afternoon came to an end, I carefully folded the coat and left it outside his private office, hoping the unusual moment would quietly disappear. Instead, it seemed to become the beginning of something even stranger. The following morning, a warm vanilla latte rested on the housekeeping counter with my name written neatly across the cup. I looked around the empty break room, expecting someone to claim it, but nobody did. Did anyone order this? I asked one of the kitchen assistants. She smiled and shook her head. It was already here when we unlocked the pantry. I carried the cup upstairs, smiling despite myself because vanilla happened to be my favorite, although I had never mentioned that to anyone except Olivia months earlier. Later that morning, I spent nearly an hour polishing the bookshelves inside the East Library while a cool breeze drifted through an open window. I rubbed my hands together, wishing I had remembered to bring my sweater. A moment later, the window quietly closed behind me. I turned, expecting another employee, but the hallway stood empty. Farther down the corridor, I caught a brief glimpse of Nathan walking away beside his executive assistant, discussing schedules without ever looking back. I could not prove he had closed the window, yet somehow I knew. Small things continued happening throughout the week. Whenever my lunch break was delayed because another task needed attention, a fresh sandwich and fruit somehow appeared in the employee lounge before I realized how hungry I had become. The old cleaning cart with the squeaky wheel disappeared overnight and was replaced with a newer one that moved effortlessly across the marble floors. Fresh gloves in exactly my size appeared inside the supply cabinet after I casually mentioned to Olivia that the standard pair always slipped from my hands. None of those things arrived with a note. None of them carried anyone's name. They simply appeared as though Sullivan Manor itself had quietly begun taking care of me. Olivia finally stopped pretending not to notice. We were arranging fresh white roses along the grand staircase when she folded her arms and smiled. "All right, Hannah. Someone is paying very close attention to you." I laughed awkwardly. "You are imagining things." She pointed toward my new cleaning cart. "That arrived on Tuesday." Then she nodded toward the latte in my hand. "Every single morning this week." Finally, she picked up the soft wool scarf resting beside my supplies. "And unless you secretly went shopping before work, this definitely did not appear by accident." I looked at the scarf in surprise. It was warm, beautifully made, and exactly the deep navy color I had admired once while passing a department store window. There was no gift tag, no message, only careful wrapping paper folded neatly beneath it. "I honestly do not know where it came from," I whispered. Olivia studied me for a long moment before smiling gently. "Whoever it is," she said quietly, "they notice the little things most people never see." That afternoon, Ethan returned to continue reviewing the renovation plans. As I prepared coffee beneath the covered terrace, he walked over carrying several updated drawings. "Hannah," he said with an easy smile, "your suggestion about preserving the original stone pathway solved one of our biggest design challenges." I looked at the blueprint in surprise. "You actually used the idea?" "Of course," he replied. "Good ideas deserve to stay." He hesitated for only a moment before adding, "When this project is finished, would you like to visit the Architecture Museum with me one afternoon? I think you would enjoy it." Before I could answer, familiar footsteps echoed softly across the terrace. Neither of us needed to turn immediately because somehow we both recognized them. Nathan approached with calm confidence and glanced at the revised drawings before looking at Ethan. "Mr. Parker," he said politely, "I would appreciate discussing a few additional details before you leave today." Ethan nodded immediately. "Certainly." Nathan then looked toward me for only a brief moment. "Thank you for preparing everything, Hannah." The two men walked toward the study together, leaving me alone beneath the quiet autumn sky. As I watched them disappear inside the mansion, one realization settled gently into my heart. Every meaningful conversation Ethan and I shared seemed to end at exactly the moment Nathan Sullivan chose to appear. The invitation arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, tucked neatly inside one of the renovation folders Ethan Parker carried beneath his arm. He waited until I finished arranging fresh flowers along the grand staircase before handing me the small envelope with an easy smile. "There is absolutely no pressure," he said kindly. "I thought you might enjoy visiting the Architecture Museum this Saturday. Afterwards, we could have coffee if you would like." I looked at the invitation for a moment before meeting his warm hazel eyes again. "That sounds wonderful," I answered honestly. His smile widened with quiet appreciation. "Take your time deciding." Before I could say anything else, Mrs. Harper called my name from across the hallway, asking me to help prepare the west drawing room for another planning session. I slipped the envelope carefully into my apron pocket and returned to work, never realizing that someone had witnessed the brief exchange from the second-floor balcony overlooking the entrance hall. The afternoon continued peacefully until Olivia found me polishing the long walnut table inside the library. She noticed the folded invitation almost immediately. "You are smiling," she teased gently. "That usually means someone interesting has entered your life." I laughed softly before handing her the envelope. She read it quickly, then looked back at me with an approving smile. "Hannah, this is actually very thoughtful. He seems like a genuine gentleman." I nodded. "He really is." Olivia carefully returned the invitation. "You deserve one ordinary evening that has nothing to do with this mansion." I slipped it back into my pocket, completely unaware that another pair of observant blue eyes had quietly noticed our conversation through the partially open library door. Later that afternoon, I carried fresh coffee into the conference room, where Ethan and several project managers reviewed architectural drawings with Nathan. Their discussion paused briefly while I arranged the cups on the polished table. Ethan smiled warmly. I updated the garden entrance exactly the way Hannah suggested, he said while pointing to one of the blueprints. She understands how people actually experience this estate. Nathan studied the drawing in silence for several seconds before giving a small nod. An excellent revision, he replied calmly. His voice remained perfectly even, but he never looked toward me. I quietly excused myself and closed the door behind me. About an hour later, Ethan found me in the conservatory while I watered orchids beneath the towering glass ceiling. I almost forgot, he said with an apologetic smile. Would 6 o'clock on Saturday work for you? I smiled back. Yes, I think it would. Wonderful, he replied. I promise the museum is much less intimidating than Sullivan Manor. I laughed, and for the first time in weeks the sound felt completely natural. Then familiar footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor outside the conservatory. Neither Ethan nor I needed to turn immediately, because somehow we both recognized them. Nathan entered carrying a folder of updated documents. His expression revealed nothing unusual. Mr. Parker, he said evenly, I apologize for the short notice, but the City Planning Committee has requested one final review before approving the restoration permits. Ethan accepted the folder without concern. Of course. When would you like to meet? Nathan glanced briefly at the schedule inside the folder. Saturday evening. 6 o'clock would be ideal. That is the only time every representative is available. The words settled quietly between us. Ethan blinked once before looking toward me with genuine regret. I am afraid I already made plans. Nathan nodded thoughtfully, his tone remaining completely respectful. The decision is entirely yours. The committee can be difficult to reschedule, but I understand if another commitment comes first. Ethan stood silently for several moments before releasing a slow breath. The permit approval affects the entire project. We should not delay it. He turned back toward me with sincere disappointment. Hannah, I am truly sorry. May I ask for a rain check? I smiled gently despite the unexpected ache in my chest. Of course, work should come first. He thanked me warmly before following Nathan toward the conference wing. I remained alone beneath the glass ceiling while the late afternoon sunlight slowly faded across the orchids. Nothing inappropriate had been said. No order had been given. No promise had been broken. Yet another quiet opportunity had disappeared just as it began. As I watched the two men walk down the long hallway together, one unsettling thought refused to leave my mind. Either fate possessed an extraordinary sense of timing, or Nathan Sullivan had quietly begun fighting a battle against his own heart that he still refused to admit even to himself. Saturday arrived beneath a sky washed clean by an early morning rain, but instead of feeling excited, I carried a quiet heaviness that had been growing inside me for days. Ethan had called before noon to apologize once again for canceling our plans, promising that he would make it up to me after the city approved the restoration permits. His sincerity only made it harder to ignore the strange pattern surrounding every opportunity we tried to create. By late afternoon, Sullivan Manor had settled into its usual elegant rhythm. Executive staff moved between conference rooms carrying folders filled with contracts, assistants answered quiet telephone calls, and housekeepers prepared guest suites for visitors arriving the following week. I spent the last hour of my shift arranging fresh white roses outside the West Conference Room, trying to convince myself that everything happening around me was nothing more than coincidence. The more I repeated that explanation, the less believable it became. When I finished placing the final arrangement, Mrs. Harper asked me to deliver several documents to Nathan's private study. I balanced the folders carefully against my arm and knocked softly before stepping inside. The room overlooked the western gardens where the setting sun painted long golden shadows across the stone pathways. Nathan stood beside the tall windows without his jacket, reviewing several reports with the same composed expression he carried into every meeting. "The files you requested," I said quietly. He accepted them with a grateful nod. "Thank you, Hannah." Normally, that would have ended our conversation. I would have wished him a pleasant evening and quietly returned to my duties. Instead, I remained standing near the doorway because something inside me refused to keep pretending everything was ordinary. Nathan noticed immediately. He closed the folder in his hands and gave me his complete attention. "Is something troubling you?" he asked gently. His voice carried concern rather than authority. I took a slow breath, searching for words that would not sound disrespectful. "May I ask you something honestly?" He nodded without hesitation. You may always speak honestly with me. Those simple words gave me more courage than I expected. I looked directly into his blue eyes for the first time since I had started working at Sullivan Manor. Ever since the foundation gala, everything has changed. He remained silent, listening without interruption. Schedules change, conversations end unexpectedly. Small acts of kindness appear without explanation. Every time I begin getting to know someone, something quietly seems to pull us apart. His expression remained calm, yet I noticed the slightest tightening in his jaw. I continued before I lost my nerve. I keep asking myself whether I am imagining all of it. The antique grandfather clock quietly marked another passing minute. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been waiting inside my heart for days. Am I only your maid? My voice became softer as I finished the sentence. Or am I someone you are afraid to lose? The room became impossibly still. Nathan looked at me as though no one had ever spoken to him with such honesty before. He opened his mouth to answer, then quietly stopped. For the first time since I had met him, the man who always seemed prepared for every conversation searched for words that simply would not come. He turned toward the fading light outside the windows before slowly looking back at me again. There was no irritation in his eyes, no frustration, only a quiet struggle he could no longer hide behind perfect manners and unwavering composure. Only an hour earlier he had guided an important planning meeting without the slightest hesitation. Now one sincere question from an ordinary maid had left him completely speechless. I realized then that silence sometimes revealed more truth than any carefully chosen sentence ever could. I did not need him to raise his voice. I did not need a dramatic confession. The answer was already standing before me, hidden inside the first genuine uncertainty I had ever witnessed on the face of Nathan Sullivan. And somehow that single moment told me more about the man behind his reputation than every quiet act of kindness he had shown me since the night everything quietly began to change. For what felt like an endless moment, neither of us moved. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock blended with the soft rhythm of rain against the windows, and the silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. Nathan slowly walked toward the fireplace before resting one hand against the carved wooden mantel. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. No, he said gently. You are not only my maid. My heart beat so loudly that I wondered if he could hear it. He lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at me with a sincerity that completely erased the distance his title had always created. That answer should have been easy, he admitted. Instead, it became the hardest truth I have ever faced. I remained silent because I knew he needed the space to continue. When you first came to Sullivan Manor, you were simply another member of a remarkable staff. You worked with quiet dignity. You treated everyone with kindness regardless of their position. You never asked for attention. A faint smile crossed his face. Then one evening I heard you call another man handsome. He gave a soft laugh that carried more disbelief than amusement. It was such an ordinary compliment. It should have meant nothing to me. His eyes drifted toward the rain beyond the windows. I convinced myself I was distracted because of the gala. I blamed long hours, business pressure, and exhaustion. I told myself that whatever I felt would disappear by morning. He slowly shook his head. Morning came. Then another morning. Nothing disappeared. I took a careful step closer. Then what was it? I asked quietly. This time he answered without hesitation. Jealousy. The single word filled the room with remarkable honesty. There was no pride hidden inside it. No attempt to defend himself. Only truth. For most of my life, he continued, every difficult situation could be solved with patience, planning, or discipline. If a company struggled, I created a strategy. If a problem appeared, I found a solution. If someone challenged me, I remained calm. His eyes met mine once more. Then I watched you smile at another man, and I realized I had encountered something no amount of experience had prepared me to face. I felt emotion tighten inside my chest. The coffee, I whispered. He nodded once. Yes. The coat. Yes. The lunches, the new cleaning cart, the gloves. Another quiet nod. Those were never meant to impress you, he said. I simply noticed the little inconveniences in your day, and helping you quietly became easier than pretending I had not seen them. I searched his face for anything that resembled manipulation or expectation. I found neither. Why did you never tell me? I asked. Nathan released a slow breath before answering. Because I wanted to be certain that if you ever looked at me differently, it would not be because of my position or my name. You deserved complete freedom to choose your own happiness without feeling influenced by mine. I looked at him with growing disbelief. Then why did every conversation Ethan and I shared seem to end the moment you appeared? Regret softened his expression. Because I failed my own principles. His honesty caught me completely by surprise. Every time I saw you laughing with him, I reminded myself that he was a good man. Every time I promised myself I would stay out of your way, I found another meeting that suddenly seemed important or another discussion that could not wait. He looked down briefly before continuing. None of those decisions made me proud. They only reminded me how frightened I had become. I moved one step closer until only a small distance remained between us. Frightened of what? I asked softly. This time he never looked away. Of watching the one person who quietly brought peace into my life choose someone else before I found the courage to tell her that she had already become the part of my days I looked forward to the most. The silence that followed no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to understanding. For the first time since I had walked through the gates of Sullivan Manor, I was no longer standing before an untouchable man whose life revolved around power and influence. I was standing before someone who had finally chosen vulnerability over pride, and somehow that quiet confession became the most extraordinary thing Nathan Sullivan had ever given me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain outside gradually faded into a gentle mist, and the quiet crackling of the fireplace became the only sound inside Nathan's study. I looked at him with new eyes, no longer seeing the powerful businessman whose reputation filled newspapers and boardrooms across the country. I saw the man who had quietly closed windows before I admitted I was cold, remembered how I took my coffee, noticed when my hands were uncomfortable inside oversized work gloves, and struggled every day against feelings he believed he had no right to ask me to return. I smiled gently before taking one slow step toward him. Do you know what surprised me the most? I asked softly. Nathan looked at me with quiet curiosity and slowly shook his head. It was never the mansion, I said. It was never the luxury cars, the private meetings, or the influence everyone talks about. Those things were impressive, but they never stayed with me after I went home. His expression softened as he listened. What stayed with me were the little things. The warm coffee waiting on difficult mornings. The window someone quietly closed before I realized I was shivering. The new cleaning cart that made every hallway easier to cross. The coat that appeared before I admitted I was cold. Those were the moments I remembered. Nathan lowered his eyes with a small, almost embarrassed smile. I hoped you would never connect them to me. I laughed quietly. That became impossible a long time ago. Another gentle knock interrupted the silence. Nathan invited the visitor inside. Ethan stepped into the study carrying the leather portfolio he had accidentally left behind after the planning meeting. His eyes moved from me to Nathan before a warm understanding slowly appeared across his face. I have a feeling I chose a very interesting moment to remember my paperwork, he said with an easy smile. My cheeks immediately grew warm. Nathan actually laughed, a quiet, genuine laugh unlike any I had heard before. Perhaps you arrived at exactly the right moment, he answered. Ethan looked at both of us for several thoughtful seconds before smiling again. Architects spend years studying strong foundations, he said. The strongest ones are never built from expensive materials alone. They are built because every piece supports the other. His words filled the room with unexpected peace. I stepped closer to him. I owe you an apology. Ethan gently shook his head. No, Hannah. You never made a promise you did not keep. Nathan extended his hand. I also owe you one. Ethan accepted the handshake without hesitation. There is nothing to forgive. Sometimes life quietly shows us where we truly belong. After wishing us both every happiness, he collected his portfolio and quietly left the study, closing the door behind him. The room somehow felt lighter after he was gone. Weeks passed, and Sullivan Manor remained every bit as beautiful as before. Business meetings still filled the conference rooms. Charity events still brought distinguished guests through the front gates. Employees still moved gracefully through endless marble hallways. Yet something had changed in